A man armed with 2 pistols this morning went on a shooting spree in 2 Arkansas towns, killing 7 people and wounding 4 others. Police say the suspect, Gene Simmons, had just...
Tonight we are learning more about an alleged murder-for-hire plot in Hot Springs.
His mother tells me she can't believe what has happened in her small community.
Brand new video just in from inside an Arkansas nightclub where a shooter opened fire.
Of a location in rural Crawford County to where the possible location of Cassie may be located.
In Bentonville, Arkansas, the hometown of Walmart, a trial is about to begin over the mysterious death of a...
I'm your host, Nicki T, and you're listening to Strictly Homicide, an Arkansas true crime podcast that discusses lesser-known cases out of the natural state. Thanks for listening to another episode of Strictly Homicide Podcast. I want to say thank you to all our patrons and everyone who rated and reviewed the show. If you enjoy the show, don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Podbean, Spotify, or any other major podcast app. Make sure to stay tuned at the end of the episode to hear a few promos from some of my favorite podcasts. Warning: Strictly Homicide covers cases that involve sexual assault, violence, and homicide. Episodes may contain explicit language and are not suitable for young ears. Listener discretion is advised. Hey y'all, thanks for tuning in to episode 14. I am suffering from allergies, so please bear with my raspy voice. On episode 14, I'll be discussing the case of Barry Lee Fairchild. This crime took place in Lonoke County, which is located in central Arkansas and was formed in 1873. Back then, settlers were brought to the area by a military road and a railroad. Now, tourists come to the area to see the Camp Nelson Confederate Cemetery, Joe Hogan Fish Hatchery, and the Toltec Mounds State Park. Lonoke County is also a dry county. Yes, we still have those. For those who don't know what a dry county is, it's prohibited to sell alcohol in the county. There are 7 cities: Austin, Cabot, England, Humnoke, Lonoke, and Ward, 3 towns, Alport, Coy, and Keogh, and 1 census-designated place, Scott. This is the location where they found the victim. The arrest of Barry Fairchild took place in Russellville, Arkansas. This is the largest city in Polk County, with a population around 28,000. Russellville homes 1 college, Arkansas Tech University, and Arkansas's only nuclear power plant. After 1828, Cherokee were removed and the land became available for the white settlement, and the first settler was P.C. Hollinger in 1834. The following year, Dr. Thomas Russell bought the home that P.C. Hollinger owned. The first business in the town was a wooden store owned by Mr. Shin. He built a masonry structure to replace the wooden building in 1875. This building still stands today and is known as the Shin Building. The town's name was between Shinville or Russellville, and we know which one of those was the winner. It was a slow-growing town until the 1870s, when the railroad was built and Russellville was incorporated as a city on June 7th. In 1870, the public school district was also formed, and by 1876, the town population boomed to about 800 people, 15 stores, 2 cotton gins, and 6 doctors. In 1893, the first class to attend all 12 grades graduated. There was a massive fire in 1906 that the town's central business district suffered from, and nearly half of the businesses were consumed. 6 months later, they rebuilt most of all of the businesses. Arkansas Polytechnic College, or Arkansas Tech University, was founded as an agricultural school in 1909. In 1965, the dam near Arkansas River crossing between Dardanelle and Russellville aided to the economic boost. The dam also created Lake Dardanelle, which is a major tourist attraction in the area. Russellville is known for its local music and art scene, and on the first Friday of every month, the city hosts an art walk in the historic downtown area. In the show Heroes, which aired on NBC, a plane crashed in Russellville in episode 15 on season 3. Many say the poorly researched Russellville was misrepresented big time. Russellville's notable people include American composer Scott Bradley, known for his work on the cartoon Tom and Jerry, Sling Blade actress Natalie Cannerday, and side note, Sling Blade also starred another famous Arkansan, Billy Bob Thornton, 1982 Miss America winner Elizabeth Grayson, along with famed knife maker Jimmy Like, known for his work on the Rambo film, and lastly, professional wrestler and reality star Matt Riviera. He appeared on the VH1 show Megan Wants a Millionaire, which only aired 3 episodes, and in 2013 he also appeared on Bravo's Millionaire Matchmaker. He currently has a YouTube show called The Matt Riviera Show. Now that you know a little more of the 2 locations mentioned in episode 14, let's get to the case. Forced confessions are something you hear about all the time, but it seems Arkansas is pretty famous for doing this. It doesn't seem to matter that there is no physical evidence, as long as they can get someone to confess. That's all they need, right? Like the time Jesse Miss Kelly gave a messy and obviously coerced confession. That's confession with air quotes. In the famous West Memphis 3 case. But years before this, an incident occurred that will make you question how much you can actually rely on confessions. Listen, I understand the importance of getting monsters off the streets, but in no way do I think it's okay to pick and choose who the monsters are without evidence and coercing them into a confession. But in 1983, they did just that with Barry Lee Fairchild. Not only did Fairchild have an IQ of 63, with a verbal IQ of 69 and a performing IQ of 61, but he was allegedly abused by the sheriff and his deputy. Barry Lee Fairchild grew up in North Little Rock in a poorer neighborhood. In school, he did not do so well, and he was recommended for special education due to his low IQ. By the 9th grade, he dropped out and remained functionally illiterate. He then was in and out of trouble for robbery. He could usually be found at his mom's, his girlfriend's house, or at gambling clubs. He often worked in grocery stores and as a busboy, but he was also a police informant to earn some extra money on the side. When his father passed away, he took it pretty hard. His mother was raising 6 children and working 2 minimum wage jobs. In December 1982, a patrolman was assigned to investigate a robbery that took place at the Circle B restaurant on Roosevelt in Little Rock. The patrolman spoke about the robbery with the owner Roy Roberts around 3:30 a.m. on December 23rd. Roy stated that he was robbed by 2 black males in their 20s. He was also able to identify the getaway car. The officer located a vehicle very similar to what was described to him a few blocks away. The officer approached the vehicle to question the men inside. The officer said there was 2 black men inside the car, and as he approached it, the 2 jumped out, firing a gun at the officer. During the investigation, a photo spread was displayed for the officer, and he identified Harold Green as one of the males. Officer Ivan Jones claimed that he had confidential information from a source that was sometimes reliable that the other robber was Barry Fairchild, but the officer would not give up his sometimes reliable source. When a photo spread was shown to Roy Roberts, the victim of the robbery, Roy identified Harold Green as the robber, but never Fairchild. On December 28th, a deputy prosecuting attorney charged Barry Fairchild with attempted capital felony murder, alleging that he fired a weapon at the officer while the officer was attempting to detain him based solely off the information from this sometimes reliable source. The clerk of the criminal division stated that she issued a warrant without any additional facts or information, stating that since the 1970s, they've been allowed to automatically issue warrants without making no independent determination of probable cause or the factual basis for filing the charge. She said that they just assume there is probable cause when a felony information is filed. On February 26, Arkansas State Troopers pursued a car driven by 2 black men who were able to abandon the Toyota and flee. When those men fled, one of them did drop their cat diesel power hat. The next day, on February 27th, a woman's body was found in an abandoned farmhouse 10 miles east of Little Rock. She was wearing a white nurse's dress, which was open, and her body was naked from the waist down. She had been raped, sodomized, and shot twice in the head, killing her. The contents of her purse were also spread around the yard. The car that was abandoned the day before was registered to a Marjorie Mason, who was a 22-year-old Air Force nurse. Marjorie was a Florida native and was recently posted in the Little Rock Air Force Base in Jacksonville, which was only 23 miles northwest of the abandoned farmhouse and 20 miles northeast of Little Rock. The men who abandoned the car got away and couldn't be identified, but they did leave behind that cat diesel power hat. An officer at North Little Rock Police Department told Pulaski County Sheriff's Office that he had an informant who often wore a hat very similar to the one left behind, naming Barry Fairchild. It didn't matter that many others wore a hat similar to the one left. This officer could provide a name, which was a start into the investigation. It didn't help that he was currently wanted for allegedly shooting at a Little Rock policeman in December. The kidnap, rape, and murder of 22-year-old white Christian women was the kind of crime that enrages locals. This was a former cheerleading and homecoming queen who was raped and murdered by one or more black men. This was the type of crime that a black suspect would have been lynched for not too long in the distant past. Police were now actively looking for Barry Fairchild and Harold Green. They were both wanted for the robbery and attempted murder of a cop. The officer who used Barry as an informant paid a visit to Barry's mother and told her that they were going to shoot him on sight because he was considered armed and dangerous. He never told her about the murder of Miss Mason or that he told the investigators that the hat they found was one worn by Barry, but only about the robbery. So when Barry's mother saw him, she took him to Conway, about 30 miles northwest, where he boarded the bus to California. The location where Miss Mason's body was found was teetering on the county line between Pulaski County and Lonoke County. Pulaski County assumed jurisdiction, and the investigation was led by Sheriff Tommy Robinson, who had a reputation for using abusive law enforcement techniques during his 4-year career as the sheriff. You may recognize the name Tommy Robinson and Larry Dill from episode 4, the MacArthur Orsini case. He was the sheriff who arrested William MacArthur without a warrant. Tommy Robinson is connected to a lot of controversy. When the state prison refused to help Tommy with the county jail's overcrowding issue, Tommy decided it would be good to generate publicity and took a group of his prisoners to the state prison where he chained them to a fence. Robinson was also quoted that he treated his black prisoners well and fed them watermelon and chicken. His jail was under court order to be upgraded because of overcrowding and police brutality against the prisoners. Robinson decided that his jail didn't need to be upgraded and failed to follow the order. A federal judge found him in contempt of court and ordered him to stay 2 nights in the jail. Police got word that Barry was on a bus to California when it was pulled over in Russellville, 85 miles east of the state line. Somehow, Barry managed to walk away from the bus during the stop. Barry hid out in the woods for several days. He would sleep during the day and roam around during the night. On the night of March 3rd, close to about 9 p.m., Barry walked up to a home close to the interstate where an elderly man lived. His son and his son's girlfriend was also living at the residence and were in their room. Barry knocked on the door. The elderly man opened the front door and was greeted by Barry, who claimed that his car was broken down on the interstate and he needed to call a wrecker. The elderly man's son and his girlfriend peeked out their window and saw Barry and noticed him from the news. Media outlets had been sharing Barry's photograph and stated that he was wanted by the police. The man who answered the door hollered to his son to contact a wrecker service. But instead, his son contacted the police and asked them to silently arrive because the man that they had been looking for is at their home. Officer Stobaugh arrived at their home and quietly snuck up on the 4 of them standing at the door talking. As he was sneaking up on them, the remaining officers quietly arrived surrounding the home. Officer Stobaugh rushed at Barry and pushed him up against the door. Barry was able to break free from the officer and run off. When the other officers who arrived saw him, they released their police dog. The police dog attacked Barry on his head and neck. At this point, the police officers were able to take Barry to the ground and place him under arrest. Officer Larry Dalton transported Barry to St. Mary's, where his wound from the dog was treated. A bite on his neck required stitches and was about 3 inches long. Once Barry was released to go, around 11:30 p.m., they drove him into Little Rock, making one stop for about 10 minutes to get gas. They arrived in Little Rock around 1:30 a.m. and booked Barry. Barry looked pretty rough. His neck was wrapped up, and his face seemed swollen. The interrogation began with Officer Reynolds, Officer Dalton, and a Pulaski County Sheriff deputy. Barry refused to answer any questions, so the officer began screaming in his face. The screaming is pretty bad for someone with an average IQ, but due to Barry's possible mental handicaps, he was way more vulnerable. At one point, Barry was slapped across the face. It's pretty obvious at this point that the abuse went on before they arrived there as well. Russellville to Little Rock is roughly 80 miles. With only one 10-minute stop, they should have arrived in Little Rock around 12:45. Barry was turned over to Sheriff Tommy Robinson and his deputy Larry Dill. Barry thought he was being brought in for robbery and attempted murder of a cop, even though it was never confirmed that he was the one who assisted Green in the robbery or shot at the Little Rock officer. But he knew that that was why they were originally looking for him. Barry didn't understand why the officers were questioning him about a rape and murder. Barry's brother Robert was also brought in for questioning and denied having anything to do with it. The officers testified that the atmosphere was comfortable with donuts and coffee, and Mr. Fairchild spoke freely to them. They said that he admitted to the crime, but they took very little notes while questioning him. That's when they decided to videotape the confession. Again, air quotes. The estimated time between the end of the interview and the beginning of the filming was about an hour. The videotape was out of focus, and the lighting was crap. As a professional photographer, I can assure you that the lack of appropriate lighting can really manipulate the eye. It was testified that if you zoomed in, or if you were in the room, that you can see that his lip was busted, his eyes were swollen, and his face just looked beat up. During that interrogation, Mr. Fairchild confessed to the crime, but his confession was not consistent with the facts of the case. The way that he answered the questions came off like a student taking an oral exam. An hour later, they decided to tape a second confession, and this time the confession was more consistent, but it also appeared as if he was responding to voices coming from off the camera, and like he was almost rehearsed. He told the police he was outside of an abandoned farmhouse, sitting in the car that belonged to Marjorie Mason, when his named accomplice raped and killed Marjorie. The accomplice he named was supplied to him by the interrogators, Mr. Green. It turns out that Mr. Green was actually in Colorado at the time of the murder, incarcerated. During the videotaped confession, Barry looked off camera and listened as if someone was telling him what to say. It appeared that someone was directing him, and then he would answer the on-camera interrogator. He never confessed to murdering Marjorie. He confessed to him and his accomplice raping her, and then he said he was outside, heard the gunshot, and it startled him. He said he went inside and asked his accomplice what he just did. The accomplice he named, or was told to name, ended up never being questioned. So Fairchild was the only one charged. Never mind that the troopers chased 2 black men the night that they found her car. After the second videotaped confession, Mr. Fairchild agreed to go with Robinson and Dill on a tour starting on Washington Street in North Little Rock. This is where they believe that Marjorie was kidnapped. The tour ended at an abandoned farmhouse where the victim was raped and murdered. The courts deny having anything to do with showing Mr. Fairchild the route and that he took them on the tour. But Mr. Fairchild says it was the opposite of that. He said that they would drive around and tell him what happened at each location. Of course, this can all be labeled as hearsay, but at the time, there is zero physical evidence that actually points to Barry Fairchild's involvement. Marjorie's car and belongings had fingerprints, but none of them could be identified as Barry's. The hat that they found when the 2 men took off, it contained hairs, but none of them matched Mr. Fairchild. The semen that was found on the victim was of someone with a type O blood, and Mr. Fairchild was type A. Even with the physical evidence pointing to someone other than Mr. Fairchild, the police had this confession. And a confession meant a conviction, right? During the trial, Barry recanted the confession, saying that he had been threatened and beaten by Sheriff Tommy Robinson and Deputy Larry Dill. He testified in court that he had no knowledge of the crime. He stated that the sheriff hit him over the head with a barrel of a shotgun while Larry would kick him in the stomach over and over again. Before the recordings, he said that he would rehearse the story that they told him to tell. During the video, there was even a point when he was asked how many times he raped Marjorie. He paused, looked behind the camera, sat and stared with his mouth open, then finally raised 2 fingers, looks back at the camera, and answers, 2 times. Despite the lack of physical evidence and the obviousness of the coerced confession, the jury believed Sheriff Tommy Robinson. Newly elected prosecuting attorney Chris Raff said that anything less than the death penalty would not be appropriate for Mr. Fairchild. And that jury, containing 11 white people and 1 black person, agreed. On August 2nd, in 1983, Barry Fairchild was sentenced to death. For years after this, Mr. Fairchild's lawyer would fight this sentence. Appeals were filed, and evidence was collected to try to prove that Mr. Fairchild was innocent. Eventually, they received a call that they thought would help bring attention to the case and help exonerate Mr. Fairchild. A call came in anonymously, telling the lawyers that they were crazy if they believed for 1 second that Mr. Fairchild was the only black man they tried to get to confess. The lawyers took this very serious. They took information and names and began investigating. What they discovered was that one by one, they would bring in suspects to be interrogated. The one thing that all these suspects had in common, including Mr. Fairchild, was that they were African American men. The men were all beaten, often very bloody, threatened with guns, being thrust upon their faces, smacked over the head. They were kicked, pushed, and knocked around, being terrorized racially, threatened with the most cruel things like being hung or thrown in the Arkansas River. They were called racist names and told that they knew that they were involved in the crime. They knew they raped and murdered Marjorie, threatening to murder them if they didn't confess. The stories were reported by local black men anonymously, all of them so similar, but they also stressed the fear of speaking publicly about the abuse. While most were afraid to testify, a few did. One of the men who went through this was Frankie Webb. He testified that Tommy Robinson and 3 other deputies tried to force a signed confession that was already written out. They called him racist names and threatened to kill him if he didn't sign the confession. He said the deputies hit him over the head with a telephone book, and Tommy Robinson pulled out a .38 revolver from his holster, held it between his eyes, cocked the gun, telling him to sign the confession. Mr. Webb said that he was close to signing when he realized that there was not a bullet in the chamber. 3 days before Barry Fairchild's arrest, 5 deputies showed up on the home of Nolan McCoy to bring him in. During his interrogation, Nolan had a gun pulled out and placed to his forehead. He testified that Captain Bobby Woodward said, "Inward, you know you done raped that nurse. Now you better tell the truth or I'm going to blow your fucking head off." He testified that he saw the finger on the trigger and thought this was it. He was about to be killed. He grabbed his arm and then saw that the gun was empty. At this same time, they were also working on getting a confession from a Randy Mitchell. McCoy testified that he actually saw Mr. Mitchell in the other room crying, and he had clearly been beaten. His eyes were so swollen that they were nearly shut. They ended up placing him in a holding cell with Charles Pennington, who told the courts that Randy Mitchell was beat so bad that his eyes were swollen and his lip was split and bleeding. When asked what happened, he replied, "They whipped my ass." Another suspect, Donald Lewis, testified that he was physically and verbally abused, being threatened to confess. He said he surrendered blood samples, saliva, and hair to the police. Victims were not the only ones who testified against the abuse. Former Deputy Sheriff Frank Gibson also testified that he witnessed abuse towards Barry Fairchild's brother Robert very shortly before Barry's arrest. He testified to witnessing them choking and beating him along with verbal threats. He also testified that Sheriff Robinson drove Roberts to a wooded area, threw him on the ground, and threatened to kill him if he didn't confess. The former deputy testified that Tommy Robinson told him, "You know what I mean? Go on and do what you need to do. I want a confession. You know what I mean." Robert still wouldn't confess to a crime he didn't commit. This is when the focus shifted to Barry Fairchild, someone with an IQ as low as 60. When asked, Mr. Fairchild said, at the time, it was life or death. If I didn't confess, they would have found my body in a ditch somewhere. During the multiple appeals, Mr. Fairchild was given multiple psych evaluations. They also obtained his school records that show he was tested with an IQ in the 60s. And finally, prior to execution, he was tested again by the State Evaluation of Prisoners, but by this point, Barry said he had gave up. He knew he was going to die in prison anyways, so he had already decided he wanted the appeal process to stop. On August 31st, 1995, Barry Lee Fairchild was executed by lethal injection. Even though many black men testified that they were abused by Tommy Robinson and Larry Dill, the courts dismissed the claims, finding that, I quote, only a few of the witnesses had probably been abused or intimidated in some manner, unquote. One of his attorneys argued that Fairchild's abuse was different because, unlike the others, Barry was unable to resist the threats and avert violence because he was mentally retarded, which made him much more vulnerable than the others. In the final petition, evidence was shown and a judge said, Mr. Fairchild was not the one who shot and killed Miss Mason. He was an accomplice. The death sentence was then reversed and a sentence of life in prison without parole was being imposed instead. But the following year in 1995, the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the judge's decision and claimed that it was too late to make this argument and only a showing of actual innocence could overcome this procedural roadblock, and then they reinstated the death sentence. After 7 execution dates passed, on August 11th, 1995, a vote occurred with the Arkansas Clemency Board, and it failed by 1 vote, which was their closest vote on record. On August 21st, just a few weeks later, Barry Fairchild was the 11th Arkansan to be put to death under the state's modern capital punishment statute. Barry's case is just one of the many cases that fit the pattern of racial disparities in death row cases that raise major concern. A study on 8 different states, including Arkansas, showed that 84% of 227 inmates being executed since 1976 killed a white person, and only 12% were being executed for killing blacks. Former Arkansas Supreme Court Justice Hollingworth said old-style Southern justice sealed Barry Fairchild's fate. He was quoted saying, "I don't think the jury needed to know anything but that this white woman was raped by a black man." Chris Raff, who was the prosecuting attorney, disagreed, saying the sentence was based off evidence, although there was no physical evidence. He was quoted saying, "Remember, there was a black juror in this case. I saw no indications that race played a part, and I think federal judges will agree with that." 1 black juror. About a year after Fairchild's conviction, Tommy Robinson went on to Congress where he served 3 terms. In 1990, he retired only to make headlines as the worst abuser in the House Bank scandal in 1992, writing 996 overdrafts, and then not being charged for it. Thanks again, everyone, for downloading episode 14 of Strictly Homicide. I also want to say thanks to our newest patron, Mary F. Your support is what keeps the show going. Don't forget that I'm holding a Patreon contest. All new patrons will be entered into a contest to win a deck of Pod Cards 2018. If you haven't seen these, go to our Facebook and check it out. They're pretty awesome. Which reminds me that I want to thank Kate from Ignorance Was Bliss for making these super awesome cards. Make sure to check our Facebook page for all the info. Next week, I'll also be releasing an episode that I recorded with Kate. Stay tuned for promos from a new rad podcast, Heartland Homicide, and also promos from Nature vs. Narcissism, Something's Not Right, and Status Pending. Strictly Homicide is written and hosted by me, Nicki T. The original music and production is done by Mr. T. No, not that one, my Mr. T.
If you have enjoyed the show, please remember to tell a friend and rate us and review us on iTunes. You can also help support the show on Patreon. Just search for Strictly Homicide Podcast.
If there is a case that you would like us to discuss, or if you have any comments, corrections, or suggestions, send us an email at strictlyhomicide@yahoo.com or contact us on social media. Visit our webpage at strictlyhomicide.com, where you can find links to all our social media, Patreon page, merchandise, and a button for one-time donations. For news on the podcast and pictures from the episode I cover, You can find our Facebook page, discussion group, and Instagram by searching for Strictly Homicide Podcast, and on Twitter at Strictly HMICIDE. Stick around to hear a few promos, and until the next time, y'all stay safe, especially you, Arkansas.
Hi, I'm Christy, one of the hosts of Heartland Homicide, a true crime podcast. My co-host Kason and I focus on cases from the heartland of the U.S. You can find us on iTunes, Podbean, and most major podcast platforms. We explore some well-known and some not-so-well-known cases close to us. We are on social media at Heartland Homicide on Facebook and on Twitter at HRTLND Homicide. And while these cases may not be Florida crazy, they are cornfield crazy.
Hey guys, I'm Heather.
And I'm Rochelle.
And we're from Nature vs. Narcissism,
a true crime podcast mixed with some dark humor.
Sometimes we have alcohol.
Sometimes we have guests.
Since I've always been fascinated by true crime, I wanted to delve deeper into the criminal mind and discuss why these criminals commit these vile acts.
Was it nature? Was it nurture? Or was it just plain old narcissism?
Join us every week for a brand new episode.
You can find us on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play, TuneIn, and Podbean.
Don't call the cops.
Bye!
Hey, this is Olivia.
And I'm Tashana.
We're the hosts of Something's Not Right. We do a bunch of research and then we tell each other crazy stories. They're usually about true crime, but we're down to talk about anything strange or disturbing.
So if that sounds like your kind of thing, and you don't mind a little salty language, check us out. For more info on Something's Not Right, visit notrightpodcast.net.
There are many true crime podcasts available, each offering a different perspective to the genre.
Each with their own niche that pulls the listener in by tugging at their heartstrings or their funny bone in one way or another.
What we aim to do with Status Pending is make you think. We want you to feel as though you're connected to the case. We want you to feel something.
The cases we're going to cover have discrepancies of some sort, and may or may not be well known.
They are either unsolved, prematurely closed, or open without any solid leads.
We want to get these stories out to the public, for the family and for the victims.
Join us every month for a different case, which will be a different chapter in our podcast, as we take a 3-part look into the facts.
We'll have interviews, expert opinions, and more. And we'll also be looking for suggestions from you for cases to take on as we move forward.
You can email us at statuspendingpodcast@gmail.com.
And you can subscribe to Status Pending wherever you listen to podcasts.